North Africa, 1942. Somewhere in the desert between Tobruk and Tripoli, a British recovery crew stands beside a burned-out Sherman tank that outweighs anything they have ever tried to move. Sand has swallowed the tracks, the turret is scorched black, and the machine parked next to it, the one about to drag 26 tons of dead steel out of a battlefield under enemy observation, was not built by the British Army. It was not built by a European manufacturer with decades of military contracts. It was built by a company most soldiers standing there had never heard of, in a city 4,000 miles away that most of them would never see. Chicago, Illinois. The machine did something that afternoon that changed how every army on Earth thought about tank recovery. It hooked onto that Sherman, took up the slack on a winch cable, and pulled it worked the way it was designed to work. Against a weight problem the British Army itself had told American manufacturers, 2 years earlier, might not be solvable at all. The company's name was Diamond T, and here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. The tank transporter that saved that Sherman, the machine that would serve in nearly every Allied army in every theater of the war, was not even the reason Diamond T earned its reputation. That reputation had already been built years earlier on a completely different kind of truck, made for a completely different kind of customer. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through 5 decisions, 5 specific choices made by one small Chicago manufacturer that took it from a struggling car maker to the truck the United States Army trusted more than almost any other on Earth. And then, without a single battlefield failure, without a single scandal, without one bad decision anyone could point to, as the killer, watched it disappear completely. Not vague company history, not a highlight reel, the actual decisions, the actual numbers, the actual mechanics of how a company builds something the U.S. military cannot live without and still does not survive. And I'm going to make you a promise right now. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly how a truck manufacturer can win a world war and lose a boardroom in the same 20 years. And the most uncomfortable part of that promise, nothing about it was inevitable. Every single step could have gone differently. Let's start in 1905 with a shoemaker's logo and a car nobody remembers. In 1905, a Chicago businessman named C.A. Tilt started building automobiles, not trucks, cars, touring cars, the kind wealthy families bought to be seen in, not the kind anyone associated with hard labor. Tilt's own background gave the company its name and its logo before it had built a single vehicle. His father was a shoemaker, successful enough to supply the Marshall Field Company, one of the most prestigious retailers in the country. When it came time to brand the family business, the elder Tilt designed a mark for his shoes, a large letter T framed inside a diamond, a symbol meant to signal quality you could trust before you'd even worn the product. When his son needed a name for his automobile company, he borrowed it directly. Diamond T. The diamond meant the same thing it had always meant. This is not the cheap version, this is the one built to last. For 6 years. That promise applied exclusively to passenger cars. Regular production of 3 touring models began around 1907, and Diamond T built a modest reputation as a maker of well-constructed, if unremarkable, automobiles in a Chicago market that was rapidly filling with competitors. Nothing about the company's early trajectory suggested it would ever be known for trucks at all. Then in 1911, a customer walked in with an unusual request. A Michigan plumbing business had bought a Diamond T touring car, liked how it was built, and asked Tilt to build them something different, a delivery vehicle, not a passenger car with cargo space bolted on. An actual working truck built with the same standards Tilt had put into his automobiles. Most car manufacturers of that era would have said no. Trucks in 1911 were a separate, lower-status category, built by companies that specialized in the utilitarian end of the market. A luxury automaker crossing into trucks was, to most people in the industry, a step down. Tilt looked at the request completely differently. If a plumbing company wanted the same construction quality in a work vehicle that it found in a passenger car, how many other businesses wanted exactly the same thing and simply had nowhere to buy it? He built the truck. It used a chain drive, a 4-cylinder Continental gasoline engine, a Brown Light transmission, Timken axles, and an O.A. Smith frame. Componentry chosen the same way you'd choose parts for a luxury automobile. The customer was satisfied, word spread, more orders followed, and within a remarkably short window, Tilt made a decision that would define the rest of the company's history. He stopped building passenger cars almost entirely and pointed the whole operation at trucks. That single request, and the choice to treat it as a signal instead of an outlier is the reason Diamond T exists in truck history at all. By 1936, what had started as a side request from a Michigan plumber had become an 8,750 truck year, the company's best on record, and Diamond T had built enough of a reputation for engineering seriousness that by the mid-1930s it had become an official supplier to the United States Army Quartermaster Corps. A war hadn't even started yet, and the U.S. military had already decided this was a company it could trust with equipment soldiers' lives would depend on. But trust from the Army isn't the same as being chosen for the hardest job available. That required something else. It required a company willing to keep building trucks like it still thought it was building luxury cars, even when the customer never asked for it. Here's something you need to understand about how commercial trucks were built in the first half of the 20th century, because without it, nothing that follows makes sense. A truck, in the eyes of most manufacturers, was a tool. Tools didn't need to look good, tools needed to work, and to cost as little as possible while working. Paint was an afterthought. Interior comfort was irrelevant. If you wanted style, you bought a car. Tilt refused to accept that division. Every Diamond T truck that left the Chicago plant, whether it was a delivery van for a plumbing company or a dump truck hauling gravel, rolled out with red-painted wheels and sheet metal. A styling signature nobody in the industry required and no customer specifically demanded. It cost more, it took more labor, it served no mechanical purpose whatsoever, and Tilt did it anyway, on every single unit, as a standing mandate. Because he had decided that a truck did not have to look like a compromise to be won. The same philosophy ran through the engineering, not just the paint. While competitors built to the minimum specification that would survive a warranty period, Diamond T consistently overspecified stronger axles than the load technically required. More robust transmissions, frames built with a margin of safety that cost the company money on every unit and returned nothing except its own reputation. Think about it the way you'd think about a pair of work boots. Most are built to survive the job and nothing more. Every so often, someone builds a pair over-engineered by any practical measure, and once you've worn one, the difference is not subtle. You feel it in how the thing behaves under stress that should have broken something cheaper. That is exactly the difference Diamond T trucks earned in the marketplace. And it is exactly why customers, and eventually soldiers, started calling them something no other truck manufacturer's product was called, the Cadillac of trucks. Not because Diamond T trucks were the fastest or the biggest, because they were the ones you could push harder than they were rated for and trust them not to fail on you when it mattered. That reputation built one over-engineered gravel truck at a time through the 1920s and into the Depression years of the 1930s. Is the exact reason the United States military didn't have to gamble when war came. When the Quartermaster Corps needed a manufacturer capable of building the single heaviest, most abused truck class in the entire Army fleet, they didn't need to test Diamond T's ability to build something tough. The company had spent a quarter-century proving it, one red-painted wheel at a time, to customers who never even asked for the extra effort. By 1939, with war visibly approaching in Europe, the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps Technical Committee made a recommendation that would define American military logistics for the next decade. Every tactical truck the Army fielded would be organized into one of 5 weight classes, half-ton up through 7.5-ton, and every one of them would be all-wheel drive. Each class went to a different manufacturer. The quarter-ton went to Ford and became the Jeep. The 1.5-ton went to Dodge and Chevrolet. And the 4-ton class, the heavy end of the fleet, the trucks that would need to survive the worst roads and carry the heaviest loads in every theater, went to Diamond T. This was not a small contract to fill quietly in the background. The 4-ton 6.6, cataloged by the Army as the G509, needed to move a genuine 4-ton payload across terrain that had no roads at all, in weather that ranged from North African heat to European mud to Pacific humidity, without the luxury of easy field repair far from any depot. It was assigned to serve as cargo hauler, wrecker, pontoon carrier, engineer support vehicle, and cartographic platform, essentially the backbone truck of the entire Army's heavy logistics chain. Between 1940 and 1945, Diamond T delivered more than 50,000 vehicles to the United States military and its allies. Of those, over 30,000 were the heavy 4-ton 6X, built across cargo, wrecker, dump, and pontoon variants, powered by a Hercules 6-cylinder engine putting out 131 horsepower, capable of hauling its rated load at roughly 37 miles per hour, with an operational range approaching 175 miles on a single tank. On top of that 4-ton production run, Diamond T built more than 10,000 half-tracks, adding another entire category of vehicle to its wartime output. Soldiers who drove these trucks across every theater of the war, from the deserts of North Africa to the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, gave the 4-ton 6.6 the same nickname. Civilians had given Diamond T's commercial trucks a decade earlier. They called it the Cadillac of American trucks. Not because it was luxurious, because in a fleet full of vehicles that broke down, overheated, or simply gave out under sustained wartime abuse, the Diamond T kept running looking like someone had actually cared how it was built. But the 4-ton, as central as it was to the war effort, was still fundamentally a cargo truck, doing a cargo truck's job at a larger scale than usual. The vehicle that would turn Diamond T from a trusted Army supplier into a legend among Allied recovery crews wasn't built to carry anything at all. It was built to save something too heavy for anyone else to move. In 1940, before the United States had even entered the war, the British Purchasing Commission approached a group of American truck manufacturers with a problem nobody had fully solved yet. British tanks were getting heavier as the war progressed, and battlefield damage was inevitable. A damaged tank left where it fell was a tank the enemy could study, or worse, repair and use against you. Recovering it meant hauling tens of tons of dead steel across desert or mud, under conditions where speed mattered because every extra hour in the open was an hour under potential fire. Nothing in the British Army's existing fleet could reliably do it. Diamond T already had something close to an answer. The company had been developing a heavy prime mover for the U.S. Army independently, and with a handful of modifications, it matched almost exactly what the British Purchasing Commission was asking for. An initial order for 200 units was filled quickly. What emerged from that order became the Model 980 and, with the addition of a front and rear winch carrying 150 meters of cable, the Model 981. Paired with a 24-wheel trailer designated the M19, the combination became known as the M19 Tank Transporter, a 12-ton 6.4 tractor capable of hauling a combined load of up to 45 tons, roughly the weight of 30 family cars, in a single load across terrain with no roads. Production began in 1941. The first units reached Britain in 1942 and went straight into the North African campaign, where they proved their reliability almost immediately, recovering battle-damaged tanks, often under hostile fire, and returning them to workshops that could actually repair them instead of leaving them as permanent losses. By the end of the war, nearly 6,000 of these tank transporters had been built, with roughly 1,000 delivered to the British Army alone, and the vehicle saw service with virtually every Allied army in every theater of the conflict. Here's the detail that makes this story more interesting than a simple success. The United States Army itself was never fully sold on the Diamond T tank transporter. American commanders generally preferred the larger M26 Dragon wagon built by Pacific Car and Foundry. And as late as April 1944, U.S. Army ground forces issued instructions that no Diamond T tank transporters should be shipped to any theater except where specifically requested for a specific purpose. The machine Allied recovery crews depended on across North Africa and Europe was, in its own home country, treated as a secondary option. That pattern, a Diamond T product proving indispensable to everyone except the country that built it, is worth remembering. Because in a very different form, it's about to repeat itself in the boardroom rather than the battlefield, and this time there would be no Allied army to keep the company alive. Everything you've heard so far describes a company at the top of its industry, a reputation built over 3.5 decades, a 4-ton truck the Army trusted across every theater of the largest war in human history, a tank transporter that Allied recovery crews in multiple countries considered irreplaceable. By any measure available in 1945, Diamond T should have had decades of dominance ahead of it. What actually happened was quieter, and in its own way, more brutal than any battlefield failure could have been. In September of 1956, C.A. Tilt, the man whose father's shoe logo had given the company its name and whose insistence on quality had given it its reputation, died. His brother, Ned Tilt, who had been running the company as president and general manager, was left to manage what came next. And what came next was a business reality that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with capital. An independent truck manufacturer, Even one with Diamond T's reputation was becoming harder to sustain profitably without a steady stream of government contracts, the same contracts that had carried the company through the war years. Without Tilt's leadership, and without a guaranteed pipeline of military orders in peacetime, arrangements for a sale had already begun before his death, and in 1958, White Motor Corporation, which had already acquired Autocar in 1953 and REO Motor Car Company in 1957, purchased Diamond T for approximately $10.1 million. At first, the change was mostly invisible from the outside. Diamond T continued to operate as its own division, kept its own name on the trucks, kept building in Chicago. But it became, in the words of people who watched it happen, progressively more white with every passing year. In 1960, to cut costs, White moved Diamond T production out of Chicago entirely, relocating it to REO's existing plant in Lansing, Michigan. The company that had built its identity, quite literally, around a Chicago address and a Chicago workforce was no longer building anything there. By 1966, Diamond T truck production stopped completely. In 1967, White formally merged the Diamond T and REO divisions into a single new entity, Diamond REO Trucks, Incorporated. The Diamond T name, the Diamond and T mark that had once belonged to a shoemaker before it belonged to a truck company, stopped appearing on new vehicles. The original Chicago plant, the one that had built the truck the U.S. Army trusted more than almost any other in its wartime fleet, closed for good. The story doesn't even end there with a stable outcome. Diamond REO, the merged company carrying what remained of Diamond T's legacy, was forced into bankruptcy on December 6, 1974. A year later, two businessmen bought the rights to keep a small production line alive in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a fraction of what the company had once been, running under a name that only partially remembered what it used to say. Across its 56 years as an independent manufacturer, Diamond T built roughly 250,000 trucks, trucks that carried cargo across 5 continents, trucks that hauled tanks off battlefields under fire, truck soldiers trusted enough to nickname after the most prestigious car brand in the country. And the company that built every one of them didn't die because the trucks failed or because a competitor built something better. It died the way a lot of great manufacturers die. It ran out of the one resource that armor plating and over-engineered axles can never protect against: capital and continuity of leadership at exactly the moment both were needed most. Here's what I want you to sit with after this video ends. Every one of the 5 decisions that built Diamond T's reputation, the pivot into trucks, the refusal to cut corners nobody asked about, the assignment to build the Army's heaviest standard truck class, the tank transporter that saved Allied armor under fire, none of them were the reason the company disappeared. Not one of the failures that ended Diamond T happened on a battlefield, or in a design shop, or on a factory floor. Every single one of them happened in a boardroom, in the years after the man who built the company's standards was no longer alive to defend them. That's an uncomfortable thing to sit with if you've spent any time admiring what companies like Diamond T actually built. We tend to assume the businesses making the toughest, most trusted products are the ones most protected from disappearing. The truck that survived the deserts of North Africa, the mud of Normandy, the humidity of the Pacific, the truck recovery crews trusted with tanks worth more than most people's houses, could not survive an ordinary corporate acquisition and a change of address. Diamond T earned the nickname Cadillac of trucks because it built things that outperformed what anyone expected of them, quietly, consistently, for over 3 decades. The tragedy isn't that the company failed to keep that promise to its customers. It never did. Every documented account of these trucks in military and civilian service says the same thing. They worked reliably, under conditions that broke lesser machines. The company simply ran out of the one thing no amount of good engineering has ever been able to manufacture: time, and someone willing to keep fighting for what it was actually worth. Diamond T didn't lose to a better truck, it lost to a balance sheet. And 60 years later, the 250,000 trucks it built and the reputation that outlived the company itself are the only parts of the story anyone still remembers.